Chapter 6 Water's Edge. The dance carried on for quite some time, and when all was said and done, Tika and Avaline had both worked up a considerable sweat and an even more impressive appetite. With the resolution of one more song, the panting pair took their leave and set off in search of a good lunch. The festival foods were obnoxiously expensive, and while that was of no concern to Tika, Avaline insisted she cover the cost of their food.
You came down here to see me, after all. I need to be a good host.
Unable to win that debate, Tika followed Avaline away from the chaotic hubbub of the festival until they found a place that Avaline knew to be affordable, a single-story tavern near the water's edge. There was a deck outside that offered a breathtaking view of the water. They found themselves a table by the railing, enjoying a cool wind howling under the arch. A collection of old piers crisscrossed the waters directly beneath the rail, allowing those who were so inclined to people-watch without being so close as to eavesdrop. Avaline slumped back in her seat after she finished off the last of her meal and let out a satisfied sigh.
This is nice,
she said softly. She lifted her tankard of water for a sip, meeting Tika's gaze over the top.
I almost never get to enjoy the festival like this. It's a refreshing change of pace.
Tika perked up. She was sure to finish off her mouthful of salad before answering.
I'm having a lot of fun too. I had no idea there was so much to do down here, or that you all knew how to party so hard.
Avaline hummed, setting her cup down on the table.
We have to party hard. We don't get many chances to celebrate down here, you know.
She pointed out.
So when we get a chance to cut loose, we cut loose.
Tika nodded slowly.
Makes sense, I guess. Are things more tame up on the arch?
Avaline asked a second later. Tika shrugged her shoulders noncommittally.
Kinda? Up there, it feels more like you're part of a grazing herd on the move. Like, there's movement and there's definitely a purpose to all of it, but it's... I want to say measured? Like, it all moves at a steady pace, but down here... it's like the whole herd got spooked and broke into a stampede, just... all the stuff, all the things, all at once, no time to stop. Ready? No? Too bad. Go!
Tika made exaggerated motions with her hands to emphasize her points. Avaline giggled at the display and shook her head.
I suppose so.
She conceded with a shrug before taking another sip of water. Off to one side, some high-pitched laughter caught Tika's attention. Curious, she turned and looked down at the pier. A trio of children, looking to be no older than 7 or 8 years old, were chasing a black cat down the pier. There was a blue-scaled fish held tight in the cat's jaws, still dripping wet and squirming in a desperate bid to get away.
Come on, Mr. Kitty,
one of the children called.
Give that back! That fishy doesn't belong to you!
Tika smiled at their adorable antics. The cat was clearly in no danger of being caught, gaining as much ground as it was, and the uncoordinated sprinting of the children left them with no opportunities to outmaneuver the feline thief either. She watched with interest as the cat turned and sprinted swiftly down a collection of sturdy wooden planks nailed to the pier that connected it to another. Her keen ears picked up the faint sound of the wood groaning under just the cat's small weight, and the boards tilted under its paws as it ran. The children went thundering heedlessly after it. Tika's heart leapt up into her throat as, just as the trio of children were reaching the midpoint of the bridge, the wood split under their feet. A horrific cracking noise filled the air, and the children's laughter morphed into panicked screams as the bridge fell away. Tika spotted signs of wood rot on the underside of the boards. Her eyes widened, and she remembered what Avaline had said the day they had met.
A lot of buildings and bridges are in poor repair, especially down by the water, where they're constantly exposed to the wind and waves.
Tika shot up to her feet.
Avaline, look!
She cried, pointing. Avaline was already moving. By the time Tika had the chance to look across the table, Avaline had risen to her feet, her chair clattering to the floor of the deck, and vaulted over the railing. Tika blinked, stunned, as Avaline landed on the pier below. She fell forward into a clumsy roll, crying out, but wasted no time getting back to her feet. In a matter of seconds, Avaline reached the fallen bridge and dove into the water. Tika blinked, stunned.
She didn't even hesitate,
she realized. A moment later, she clacked her beak, realizing that she needed to get down there and help. She thought about jumping after Avaline, but considering that her bones were hollow and thus were far more likely to break, she elected to run down instead. She turned from the rail and sprinted off the deck, tossing a few extra coins from her purse onto the table as she went. With so many people back in the festival, there was no one down by the water when Tika arrived. She was gasping for breath, her heart hammering frantically in her chest, and her veins burning with dread. She all but slammed into the rope rail that separated her from a lengthy drop into the water below. Avaline was just managing to keep herself afloat. Two of the children, a boy and a girl, were clinging to her for dear life. The third child, however, another boy, was farther away, too far to reach. He was splashing frantically, graceless and formless. Tika felt a thrill of terror run down her spine as the tide pulled him further and further away. If this kept up, the boy might drown.
Avaline!
Tika shouted down to the water, her clawed fingers digging deep into the rope.
What do I do? I don't know how to swim! Rope!
Avaline shouted back.
Find rope!
Tika nodded sharply and cast her eyes about. She spotted a spool of rope curled up on a crate on a neighboring pier. It was a little farther than was ideal, but with no other options presenting themselves, Tika ran for it at a full sprint. The boy's terrified cries of desperation echoed in her ears all the way. She risked a glance, and she saw that, try as she might, Avaline was unable to close the distance to the drifting child, not with two other children clinging to her as their literal life raft. Tika took the rope in her hands, her heart pounding so hard in her chest that she was afraid she might pass out. She didn't think she'd ever run so fast in her life when she turned and ran back to the closest point on the pier to the boy.
Just hang on!
She shouted as she tied the rope around a post.
Help!
The boy screamed, his words muffled and gurgling from the water.
Someone help!
Tika finished tying the rope and gave it a tug. Satisfied that it would hold, she tossed it out into the water as hard as she could. She watched the end trail through the air, wavering slightly as the breeze hit it, and dared to hope it would be enough. It was a dare she would lose, as the rope landed in the water several feet from the boy, too far for him to reach with his hands. The tide was still carrying him further out.
Come on, kid! Make circles with your arms! Kick your feet!
Tika called after him, but the boy was panicking too hard. Either he couldn't hear her, or he could not listen. He splashed and he splashed, his wails reverberating in her skull. And then he went under.
No!
Tika shrieked, her legs tensing as instinct took over. She was about ready to dive into the water herself to give chase.
Stay put!
Avaline shouted, her commanding voice the only thing stopping Tika. She looked down to see the human woman hauling herself and the children to the rope with powerful strokes of only one arm. A few seconds later, Avaline reached the rope and the children clamped onto it instead of her. She gave Tika a meaningful look.
Pull them up!
Then Avaline turned and dove after the boy. Tika lost sight of her almost instantly. A whole new panic filled her, but she forced herself to stay where she was. The two children clinging to the rope were still crying out in fear, adrift in the water with only a rope to keep them afloat. Tika took a breath, grabbed the rope, and began to pull. She tried not to worry about Avaline as, bit by bit, the children came closer. She tried not to imagine Avaline or the boy drowning under the waves as her legs braced so hard they burned, and her arms trembled from the strain. She tried not to imagine bubbles breaking the water surface up ahead as the children reached the support pillars. The water had done wonders to ease the burden of pulling the children closer, but as they reached the base of the pier, Tika realized with a pit forming in her stomach that she lacked the physical strength to lift them up. She groaned with strain and effort, her talons digging into the wood to hold her in place, but try as she might, she couldn't get the children up more than a couple of inches.
Damn it! Help!
She shouted at the top of her lungs.
Children in the water! Help us!
The girl called up to her, her voice shaking. Whether it was from the cold or out of fear, Tika couldn't tell. She looked down at the kids and tried to smile reassuringly.
Just hold on,
she told them, unable to quell her own anxious trembles.
Help's gotta be on the way. What about Wade?
The boy asked, glancing out at the water.
He's under. Avaline's got him.
Tika reassured him, her eyes darting to the waves, looking for any sign of the two. They were still under. She cringed.
She'll take care of them. Just worry about yourselves.
Several seconds passed. Tika called out for help again, and this time someone answered. She heard footsteps running up to her from behind. Risking a glance, she saw an older man charging toward her. "What happened?" he demanded.
Bridge broke.
Tika explained as the man came to a stop by her side and took hold of the rope.
3 kids fell in. One of them went under. My friend's trying to bring him back up.
"How long have they been down there?" the man asked as he planted a foot against the support beam and pulled for all he was worth. Tika gasped at the world of difference his assistance made, and the children began to ascend.
Too long,
she said, straining with effort as they hauled the 2 whimpering children back up. She glanced out at the water again. Still no sign of Avaline. A few more people were arriving at this point, heeding the calls for help, and they too lent their strength to the cause. In short order, the children, crying and shaking like leaves, were deposited roughly onto the wood of the pier. The moment the weight was off the rope, Tika staggered back and fell onto her backside, gasping for breath. She watched as more people crowded around the kids, getting them away from the edge and granting them whatever means were available to help them get dry and chase away the cold. Tika breathed a sigh of relief. They were safe. But Avaline wasn't. She groaned in discomfort, but forced herself to rise again. She ran to the rail and looked down over the edge. No Avaline, no boy. Her feet tapped anxiously against the ground as fear and dread gripped her heart. She clacked her beak over and over again. Any second now, any second, Avaline would come back up with the boy, right? They'd be fine, right? 5 seconds. 10. Tika's heart began to sink. She wanted so desperately to dive in there and help, but there was nothing she could do. If she dove in now, she'd only be making things worse. A handful of other people gathered at the rail, all of them quiet.
Avaline?
She whispered. The quiet utterance echoed like thunder in her ears. Movement. Tika's eyes zeroed in on one spot in the water. There was something down there. Bubbles breached the surface, and whatever it was ascending. Tika held her breath as if she was under the waves herself. Avaline's head broke the water, and the girl sucked in a deep lungful of air. In her arms, unconscious, was the boy.
Avaline!
Tika shrieked, already throwing the rope down into the water at the same time that the man who helped her before dove over the edge. More hands were again on the rope as a few people broke away from the safe children to help save one more, and everyone braced to pull. Avaline, gasping and coughing, swam sluggishly to meet the man. He wrapped an arm around her under the water as soon as they made contact, then took hold of the rope with the other. He turned his eyes back to the pier. "Pull!" he shouted. And they pulled, and pulled, and pulled. A rhythm was found almost immediately, like a steady drumbeat. Pull, breathe, pull, breathe, repeat over and over. Avaline and the boy reached the pier and began their ascent. And despite being clearly exhausted, Avaline was still carrying her own weight, pressing her feet against the barnacle-encrusted support pillars to keep them going. Finally, Avaline and the boy were on the pier. The second their bodies crumpled onto the wooden planks, Tika released her hold on the rope and dove to envelop the shivering girl in a hug.
Avaline! Oh, Suna's breath, are you okay?
Avaline returned the hug, pinned to the pier by Tika.
I'm okay.
She panted, gasping for breath and shivering from the cold.
Don't worry about me. Is the boy okay?
Tika turned to look at Wade. He was out cold and pale as snow. He was shivering, however, which meant he was alive. She took a deep breath and let out a relieved sigh before giving Avaline a warm smile.
He's alive. I think they're gonna be okay.
Avaline's head fell back to the deck with a soft thump.
Thank the gods,
she breathed, her eyes drifting closed. She put a hand to her forehead and focused on breathing. Tika watched her for a few seconds, and as the adrenaline began to dissipate, a whole new emotion welled up within her. It was those butterflies again, dancing about in her stomach as it fully dawned on her what had just happened. She reached out and took Avaline's hand in her own.
You are amazing, Avaline.
Avaline shook her head, but she still smiled.
It wasn't anything special. I was just looking out for my people, that's all.
She tried to dismiss, but there was no hiding the tiny glimmer of pride hiding in her voice. "Don't sell yourself short, kid," came the voice of the first man who had come to help. Tika and Avaline looked to see him cradling Wade's unconscious form in his hands. The shaking boy was wrapped up in the man's shirt, staving off the worst of the cold. The man smiled at Avaline. "If you hadn't dove in, this kid would have drowned. You did good." Avaline nodded along quietly. The man hefted Wade in his arms, then nodded for the tavern. Tika followed his eyes and saw that there was a line of spectators gathered along the railing. Other diners who had seen what happened. The man spoke up. "That said, we should get these kids inside, where it's warm and we can dry them off. You should come too." Avaline took a shaky breath.
Sure. Yeah. Tika, help me up? Right,
Tika said, helping Avaline back to her feet. She let the woman lean against her for support and wrapped her arm around her side to hold her steady, pressing their sides close together. If Avaline had any complaints about the close contact, she did not voice them. The man nodded. "All right, come on, let's go," he said before turning and taking the lead. Tika followed along behind him while the other children clustered around his legs to keep close to their friend. They walked in silence for a few seconds, affording Tika a chance to think. She looked to Avaline and grimaced.
I'm sorry I wasn't very helpful.
She lamented quietly.
None of that.
Avaline immediately stopped her. She gave Tika a warm smile.
You did wonderfully. You called for help when we needed it. You have nothing to apologize for, you hear me?
Tika nodded, but she still felt bad, irrational though she realized it was. It had taken her several seconds to even process that there was a crisis. In comparison, Avaline had leapt in to save the day basically immediately. Maybe that was another difference between the way they lived their lives. Tika was used to ease and comfort, and knowing that everyone was safe. When things went awry, there were other people on hand to handle it, like the city watch. So if there weren't, she would stall, just like she had when her doll had gone rampant all those years ago. But for the people in Archshade, Avaline had said it herself. Things could get hard down here. They had to look out for one another, and that meant they had to be ready to act on a moment's notice. Tika realized then that there was a lot she could learn from them. After a few more seconds, Tika heard someone clearing their throat. Looking up, she saw the two still conscious children had doubled back to walk closer to them. The girl looked sheepishly at them both.
Thank you very much for saving us.
Avaline smiled.
Think nothing of it, but be more careful from now on, okay? These old piers aren't as sturdy as they used to be. We will, miss. Thank you again.
The girl said before bobbing quickly in a curtsy and moving back to be near Wade with her friend. Avaline puffed out a breath.
I think I should probably be getting home once we're all dried up.
Tika nodded in agreement.
Yeah. I think that's enough excitement for one day,
she said quietly. She pulled Avaline a little closer to her side, enjoying the contact while she had the chance.
Really, though, you were super brave. I mean it, Ava, you were incredible. Well, it would have ended a lot worse if you hadn't been there,
Avaline said, returning the side hug and leaning her head on Tika's shoulder.
Thank you.